Today to our viewers in Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands. My name is Tomas Manglona, reporting from Saipan, and today we're grateful to be joined by Maisie B. Tenorio. She's the Executive Director of the Northern Marianas Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. Thanks for joining us, Maisie. How are you doing?
Hey, Tomas. Hi, thank you so much to you and to KUAM for having the coalition on your show today.
All right, great. We want to go ahead and jump right in. So, for our viewers in Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands who might not be as familiar, who makes up the Northern Marianas Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, and what is the organization's mission?
Okay, thank you. The Northern Marianas Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence is a nonprofit, community-based organization here in the NMI. We are based in Saipan, but our work is throughout the islands, the NMI. We are an anti-violence organization, and our mission is to promote, nourish, and sustain a collective movement against violence. We were created by a group of advocates, back in 2007, who believed that, our community was ready to take our movement against domestic violence, against sexual assault to the next level. So we have a membership that is made up of organizations and individuals from Saipan, Tinian, and Rhoda. And then our organization is run by a group of 6 amazing individuals, including myself as the director. We have Kiki Benjamin, Shane Mendiola, Audrey Adda, Lenny Tenorio, and Esther Sablan, who are working every single day to create a CNMI where every single person, regardless of your age, ethnicity, faith, gender, can live free of violence and abuse.
Thank you for sharing that. And now I wanted to talk about that statement that your organization posted online. You write that during this time, survivors may be forced to remain isolated with abusers, putting them more at risk of harm. Of course, because of this global pandemic, we're being told to stay home. And you write that help is available. So, for those in the NMI, what does that help look like?
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. And in communicating with advocates and first responders out on the ground in the CNMI, they just want our community, especially victims and survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, to know that services have not shut down. They are available, many of them 24/7, to provide services to victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. For example, CareDot has a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week hotline, and the number is 670-234-5100. And that's a number that you can call if you need help with a restraining order, if you need access to their residential shelter, if you need access to their food bank, which is open every now and again. That's that number that you can call is 234-5100, again, for CareDot. The family court is also available. Judge Kim Tenorio, who's our family court judge, is committed to being available, to making sure that, if victims need temporary restraining orders, that she's available to review them and sign them. And the number for family court is 783-7825. DYS also is there 24/7 to receive reports of child abuse, child sexual assault, and neglect, and their number is 287-1773. So for everyone from the hospital, the sexual assault nurse examiners, even despite all the things the hospital is doing right now, they're still committed to serving victims of sexual assault. From the Office of the Attorney General, who's working every day and really wants us to let victims know that they are working with DPS and DYS on reports of domestic violence and sexual assault. They just want us to emphasize the fact that there are responders and advocates and providers out there working every day to help survivors, especially now, to make sure that they have access to services.
And thank you for that, Macy. And I know we've talked offline about, some officials locally, regionally, nationally. We have some viewers here chiming in from Texas. Um, some leaders saying that crime just isn't happening now. We've spoken about how that's just absolutely false. So, can you share with our viewers why that's untrue? Why the notion of no crime happening right now is untrue?
Right. And I think especially with domestic violence and sexual assault, there can be a misconception about reporting. And oftentimes people equate whether it's happening with reports. They may think that because we are not seeing as many reports of domestic violence or sexual assault, that it may not be happening right now. But the unfortunate truth is that times like this, in times of disaster, in times of a pandemic, incidents of domestic violence and sexual assault can actually increase. When everybody is being asked to stay home, they may be staying home with somebody who's causing them harm, either through domestic violence or sexual assault or both. That happens often as well. Um, Victims and survivors may not be able to leave their home to get help. They may not be able to call. They may not have access to a phone. The person who is abusing them may take away, the internet, may take away the phone, may not allow them to leave the house to get services. So we may not be getting as many reports because survivors and victims are just not able to do that right now. And so I think it's important for our community to understand the dynamics, of domestic violence and sexual assault that often, it's grounded in control. So abusers are doing everything that they can to control the situation, and often that includes taking away victims' access to the world around them. And when, like you said, with the person who's causing you harm, all of those barriers are magnified. So if they were isolated before the pandemic, they are even more isolated right now. Um, the example that I always think about, is a child who may have been living with somebody who was physically abusing him or her or sexually assaulting him or her before the pandemic. And now the abuser has access to them 24/7, and the child does not have anymore their school, which may have been a safe haven for them. They no longer have access to supportive adults that they can trust, or supportive adults who may be able to see what the signs are. Um, so so now their world is just absolutely devastated because they have no access. Um, so it's more critical for us as community members, as family members, as neighbors, to be aware of what's going on in the homes around us, and be ready to provide support when and if folks reach out to you for support.
Thanks for that. I know you alluded to some of the barriers, but just discussing them a little more, what might be some of the obvious and not so obvious challenges in terms of access to care right now in the cinema?
Sure. There are so many groups in the CNMI who were already experiencing barriers to care, like you said, or to accessing services before the pandemic. Groups, for example, if you identify as somebody in the LGBTQ community, if you are a survivor with a disability, if you are a child or a survivor who is older, may qualify as a manamko, or a survivor who doesn't speak English, or somebody who is undocumented. All of the people who identify as part of these groups um, are experiencing incredible barriers to accessing services because oftentimes we have services where people have to go to get the service, right? For example, they may have to go to the hospital, or they may have to go to the pharmacy, or they may have to go to CARDOT or the court or other, all those agencies and organizations are incredible and they provide wonderful services, but getting to them is a huge barrier for many of our community members who were already afraid to get help before the pandemic and are even more so afraid now, um, because they're just living in so much fear and shame. Um, and as a community, we may not realize that these groups have additional barriers than sort of the rest of us who can speak English or who have a car or don't live with violence and abuse. We think it might be so easy for us to just go and get these services. But that's not true for many of our community members. If you add the additional stress of what's happening right now with the furlough, We have thousands of people in our community who have lost either their entire income or half of their income because of the furlough. Um, and this creates an environment of enormous stress. And if you are a victim who was already living with violence and abuse, and you put on top, layer on top of that, the pandemic, and then put the additional layer on top of that of the furlough, um, you know, we're creating an environment that is just so traumatizing and harmful for many of our, many of the victims and survivors out in our community right now. Um, so again, and I know I've said this earlier, but it's so critical, and now especially for all of us to be kind of hyper aware of what's happening in our villages and in our community, because if people cannot access services, we have to be able to sort of bring the services to them. Bring a phone if they don't have a phone to call. If a child, if a child in your neighborhood is living with violence and abuse, call DYS for that child. And if somebody just needs someone that they can talk to, or somebody to give them that phone number to call, we're encouraging everyone to educate themselves and be ready, because people always say, like, we need to encourage victims to report, right? We hear that all the time. We need to encourage victims to report. We need to empower them to report. But when they do report, are we going to be ready to receive that information? Are we going to be ready to say, I believe you, and it's not your fault what happened to you, and here's a number that you can call, and if you call this agency, these are the services that they're going to provide, and I'm going to stay here with you while you call. Are we ready to do all of that? So it's so important, especially now, for our community to take on that role.
Right. Thank you for that, message of reassurance that there is that help even amid this crisis. Now, I wanted to talk about those who might be willing and able to support survivors. For people wondering what can they do, what are some of the options?
Sure. Like I said earlier, if you know of a child who is living with abuse, physical abuse, neglect, sexual assault, abuse, please call DYS and or DPS. Um, we can't leave children in situations where they're being harmed. If you know of an adult who is living with violence and abuse, my coworker shared with me this method. It's called the TALK method, TALK. And so I'd just like to share that. So the T is for thank the person for telling you their story. Oftentimes, that first sort of interaction with somebody, the first time somebody says, my partner is abusing me, or I'm experiencing sexual assault, or this bad thing happened to me, the very first time that somebody talks about it, is very difficult. So thanking them for sharing their story, thanking them for trusting you with something so personal, is always a good first step. And the A is ask. Ask how you can be helpful, without assuming what they need. Ask them what they need, and they will tell you. The L is to listen without judgment. I think that is the one of the most powerful things that we can do for survivors, is to listen without judgment and remind them that the harm that's being done to them is not their fault. And the K is to keep supporting. I've heard this from many family members over the years, that it's hard. It's hard to be there for somebody who is living with violence and abuse, because oftentimes, like for example, in domestic violence situations, we might find that a survivor might reach out for help, but then they may go back with their partner, and they may reach out for help and go back. And that is normal in terms of what happens in a relationship where there's domestic violence. But family members can feel overwhelmed with that. So we always encourage them to keep that line open, to keep supporting, and stay patient, because you never know when they're going to reach out for help, and that might be the time that they're really ready to go out, and leave their abusive situation, and they need somebody who's going to be available for them.
Thank you for sharing that helpful reminder. Now, I also wanted to talk. Everyone's trying to ask the question about this return to normalcy. I think the times are uncertain. And so, when discussing the topic with you today, I wanted to ask about, in the long run, how does this kind of affect the organization's local efforts? Looking ahead, what are some of the adjustments being made with this pandemic, with seemingly no end in sight for it right now as we speak?
Right. Um, we've been saying for years at the coalition that as a community, we need to take ownership of this issue. We need to say, as a community, that domestic violence and sexual assault is not tolerated here, and take action, right? Take action in our homes and in our villages to prevent and end domestic violence and sexual assault. Oftentimes, we depend and lean on the criminal justice system like DPS, the AG's office, the court to kind of be there, even Caradot, other community based service providers to be there and to fix the issue, right? To just intervene when victims reach out for help or when they report. But that in and of itself is not going to change our community. It's not going to end domestic violence. It is not going to end sexual assault. Um, that is the work of us as individual community members. And it is our hope at the coalition that in this time, right, in this time when we only really have ourselves to lean on and depend on, that we will, those additional and courageous steps to educate ourselves about domestic violence and sexual assault, and to be there, take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones and your family members, because that is the change that needs to happen in our community, is for us to take ownership of it, and do what needs to be done. We are constantly asking victims and survivors, children who have lived with violence and abuse, to do courageous things like report. Um, Reporting is just the very beginning of what can happen when somebody is seeking justice and healing. And the system and the process is so long and daunting. And so, but we expect that children who have lived with sexual assault, we expect them to do that. But we ourselves may not be ready to provide that long term support that people need to get through that process. And, Laura Gomero, the executive director at CareDot, has shared this with me and people many times for years, that oftentimes survivors, they may not be looking for that verdict at the end of the trial. What they're looking for is to be validated. What they're looking for is to be believed, right? It's for their family members to say, I believe you when you tell me that this bad thing happened to you, and I'm going to have your back 100%. We're going to rally around you. We're not going to leave you in the middle of this process all by yourself. Because unfortunately, that happens quite a bit to all survivors. And that adds to the fear and the shame of reporting. And that is especially true in communities like ours, where it's a small community. But if we educate ourselves, if we understand the real root of the problem, it drugs and alcohol, you know, magnify and it's a factor, but they don't cause domestic violence and sexual abuse. People do, humans do, we do. And so starting to understand that, I think, will go a long way. And I'm hoping that in this time, right, where we actually have moments to reflect and think and reach out to each other, that we are going to do that in a way that is more courageous than we have been in the past.
Thank you for that. And Macy, as we wrap up the interview right now, what are your additional words of encouragement? You've provided many already, but maybe some last reassurances to survivors and those having a difficult time right now staying at home.
Yeah. Um, when I was thinking about, we were thinking of my team and I were thinking about this question, and there's just so many things that we want to say to survivors out there. But the thing that we always turn to is to let them know that, we see you, we believe you, and we're here. And we know that times are so challenging right now for you, and the mountain may seem insurmountable. But we are ready to walk with you up that mountain every single step of the way. And if you just make that call, Carrot Out is a good number to call, the 234-5100. It's open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Somebody will answer. And even if you don't want services, you just need someone to talk to, we're here again for that. Please just reach out to us, and we're here for you.
All right, we want to thank Maisie B. Tenorio, who you just heard from there, from the executive director, part of a team at the Northern Marianas Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. Maisie, we thank you so much for your time, and we thank the viewers for their time, both Guam, in the Marianas, and across really the mainland U.S. as well. And my name is Tomas Manglona, reporting here on Saipan, and we're grateful that you joined us. Thank you so much.